So today is the fourth and last Sunday of our series on reclaiming Paul. And we've been going through some of the stranger middle passages in his first letter to the church in Corinth and finding new meaning in them that maybe we hadn't seen before, but also that we possibly want to look over because Paul's writings have been used to do so much harm in the church. So we're trying to reclaim him as part of our holy texts, part of our scriptural writings in which we vest authority, but find new and hopeful meaning in him. And I personally think a lot of the ways that Paul's writings have been used to do harm to women, to the LGBTQ community, generally in the church, in trying to enforce a particular orthodoxy. Those ways are actually really unfaithful readings of the Apostle Paul because he is such a contextual theologian. He is always trying to teach and to reach people in their context. He's addressing specific issues within churches. And so in general, when we read Paul, we have to be really mindful of why he's writing to a community and what he's talking about, how he's trying to instruct them, and to dig a little deeper instead of just taking what he says and then overlaying it onto 21st century America and believe that we have some absolute unchangeable truth in his writings. So again, if this is the first sermon that you're seeing in this series, I love the Apostle Paul. And so I'm really excited to be digging into his first letter to the Corinthians, and finding meaning for us, even in a more progressive church context, even in an inclusive context, even in a context where women are in leadership in very obvious and visible ways. So today's reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 through 23. And this one, I think, of all of the past four passages that we've looked at, is actually maybe the most difficult to find a word for us today in, because Paul's writing about himself. In this whole chapter, Paul is going into the context of this chapter. Paul is going into sort of a prolonged speech to the Corinthians, justifying himself to them, justifying how he does ministry to them, why he does ministry to them, and sort of what motivates him. And so it's very personal for Paul, and we see him do this in some of his other letters too. Paul loves to use himself as an example of preaching the gospel and of apostleship. And so he's making a case for his own authority in this chapter. And so it's likely that someone was challenging his authority. That seemed to have happened pretty often to him. And so he would line out all of the things that he did. The fact that he was due a wage for preaching the gospel, but he denied it. He instead was, as we know, involved in tent making. He earned his own keep. Paul, in other letters, goes in and talks about how he's a Roman citizen, how he is educated in the Jewish law, how he has all these credentials, but instead he chooses to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Paul here, even though he's talking about himself, even though he's talking about his own ministry, even though he's defending what he does and why he does it to people in order to get them to listen to him about all of these other things, I think there still is a good word in here for us today. Although I have to say, the word he's giving us, I think, in this passage is maybe a concept that we're not super comfortable in progressive and progressive-leaning churches. Ultimately, what Paul's talking about with regards to himself is his own apostleship. Now, apostleship is a word that gets used a lot in some of our more conserving Christian traditions, but I have very rarely heard it used in more mainline or even mainline and progressive Christian contexts. But what apostleship is it means having enthusiasm, having missionary zeal, we might say, for going out and starting new expressions of faith. When you do a whole lot of spiritual gifts inventories, if they assign you the apostleship gift, it means they think that you're ready to go and try and do new things. Apostleship is related to evangelism. And so I have noticed in churches that lean more progressive, we're not super comfortable with the idea of going out and planting new churches, being missionaries in places where the gospel has not gone before, or even evangelizing within our own communities, because evangelism, and for good reason, has gotten a negative connotation for a lot of people. Apostleship or apostling activities, going out and starting new faith communities or taking the good news of the gospel to other places, has a lot of historical baggage that's very real and that we're very aware of. Now, I know I'm completely 100% aware of the damage that evangelism has done, and the idea of being apostles in the world, what that has done, and how it has been married to white supremacy, how it's been married to capitalism, how it's been a tool of colonialism, both in places outside of North America, but also here. There is a long history of evangelism being the excuse for the enslavement of people. There's a long history of evangelism being the excuse for removing Native children from their families and putting them in missionary schools, of moving people off their land, of forcing people, truly through force, through violence, to give up their cultures in order to be quote unquote Christianized. So there's a good reason that people kind of shy away from the idea of evangelism for historical reasons. But even in a modern context, there's a sense that the idea of church planting, of apostleship, and of evangelism has not been done in ways that maybe are comfortable for us. I can think of friends back in college who would take their summer vacation, go live at the beach in Florida somewhere, and they were actually on a mission to evangelize people who were on the beach. They would walk up to strangers and ask them if they had heard about Jesus, and then try to share a word with them. So there's that. But then there's also the fact that we can look and see the way that there have been almost clones of like mega churches that have popped up, and that's tied to this idea of apostleship too. And so the reality for us here at Oconee Street, perhaps, is that we maybe shy away from the concept of apostleship, or the idea that we have, that we have some kind of role to play in being apostles in the world. And maybe we even take that as far as evangelism, because we know the historical damage that it has done, and that's very real. But also, I don't know that this church has any interest in looking like megachurches, which get replicated in different places, and there's a strong sense of the gift of apostleship and the necessity of evangelism in those churches too. So despite all of that, despite the baggage we might have around this idea of having zeal to share the gospel with people in new places or in new ways, that doesn't relieve us of our duty as Christians to share the good news of the gospel. Even if we're a little icky about what has happened before, how other Christians do evangelism or see their roles as apostles, that doesn't mean that we can just step back and sort of cede that ground. We still need to have missionary zeal. We still need to want to take the good news to people who haven't heard it before. And I actually think, and this maybe is counterintuitive, I actually think that Paul gives us some really good advice on how to be apostles now, how to be evangelists now in healthy ways, in ways that actually would drive us away from the mistakes of the past, or away from the ways that we don't want to be associated with in our own part of the Christian tradition. So I just want to raise 2 points that I think are important in this particular passage, in how Paul talks about his own apostleship that can apply to us. So the first one is that for Paul, him being an apostle, him sharing the gospel, starting churches all over Asia Minor, preaching, teaching, correcting people, writing all these letters, None of that is about him. And he says this over and over and over again in his letters, that nothing he does is for his own gain. He's not seeking enrichment. That's why he doesn't take a wage. He's not seeking status. He, in fact, aligns himself in this letter with the lowest of the low in this church, which probably was a surprise to the people in the Corinthian church. They would, with systems of patronage that existed in the Roman Empire, and other apostles utilizing those systems of patronage, you would want to be affiliated with the rich and powerful because they could pay you to preach. But Paul doesn't want to do that, because Paul's not interested in what he gains from the gospel on sort of a personal level. What he's interested in is preaching the gospel to people. He's interested in the reward, the spiritual reward he gets from sharing this good news that he knows. And so for Paul, you have to have this purity of purpose in your apostleship, in your evangelism. Now, what that looks like in the modern church is that we can't be concerned about expanding our Christian empire. We can't be concerned about reclaiming the idea of Christendom, of a Christian nation and a Christian world. We can't be concerned with the metrics that our denomination wants us to report. We can't be concerned about butts and seats and dollars and plates. If we're seeking to evangelize, if we're seeking to act out of a sense of apostleship, it has to be a pure motivation of simply wanting people to know the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's something that we see Paul doing. And it's something that we need to remember in what we do. The second one that I think we hear from Paul in this section of this letter is that Paul meets people where they are in his apostleship. Now, there's this part in this part of the letter where Paul says, to slaves I've become a slave, to Jews I've become a Jew, to those under the law I've become as those under the law. It's easy to read that and think Paul's being kind of fake, or that he's telling you to just tell people what they want to hear, or to not have any sense of identity and to just, to be a chameleon. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that he meets people where they are. There's not a test of orthodoxy in order to come to believe. He's not concerned with, are people of a certain status? Are they living a certain way before they come to believe? He's not concerned about any kind of purity test for entrance into the church. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't expect people to start living a certain way, to start living as part of transformed community once they are believers. But in order to come to believe, he is meeting people where they are. He's bringing the good news to folks who need the good news. This runs contrary to all of the behavior tests that churches put in place, both now for people to become, a part of the church, to really prove themselves to be Christians, but also it runs contrary to all of the ways that that colonialism and evangelism and apostleship were married to each other in our Christian past. So often, in order for people to be Christian, they had to look and act white and European. They had to lose whatever identity they had in order to be Christian. And those effects are still happening within our church, and our own denomination is reckoning with those dynamics. But Paul is not about that. Paul's not about that you have to look or act or be a certain way in order to become a believer. Paul wants to go to people and preach to them in their need. This is also in line with, we see John Wesley doing the same thing. When he says that he submits to be more vile, what he's saying is he's putting aside all of his ideas that he has to be a high church preacher, that he has to preach in the church, in the pulpit, in a robe, in the Church of England, to people with a particular level of education and social status. Because what John Wesley does in his sense of apostleship and in his sense of meeting people where they are is that he goes to the mouths of coal mines. He goes out into the streets. He goes out in front of taverns and bars and preaches to people who are struggling, who are hurting, who are poor, who are being crushed under the cog of the Industrial Revolution in England, and who need a good word, a word of liberation even. And more importantly than any of this, is we see Jesus meeting people where they are too. Jesus does not meet people and tell them, well, I'm going to heal you if you do these things. I'm not going to forgive your sins if you do these things. Jesus loves people, forgives people, heals people right where they are, and then he calls them to follow him. So if we understand ourselves as evangelists and as apostles, then we also have to know that the thing we need to do, the way we need to be evangelists and apostles, is to go meet people where they are, in the hurting and broken places in their lives, and offer the healing and the wholeness that we know through Jesus Christ. We don't need to offer them orthodoxy. We need to offer them hope. We need to offer them truly good news. Now, ultimately, undergirding all of this, all of what Paul is doing, and we especially need to pay attention, what we especially need to pay attention to is that Paul himself, in his apostleship, is sharing a grace that he knows himself, that he knows personally. The reason Paul has this zeal that leads him to apostleship, that has a purity of purpose, that leads him to meet people where they are, is because he himself, in a real personal way, knows how good this news he's sharing is. He's able to meet people where they are because he was there too. And Jesus met him in that place. We've got to know that truth for ourselves. We've got to know what we're sharing and why we're sharing it. We've got to be apostles, be evangelists, have missionary zeal out of our own experiences, having our lives transformed because we know Jesus, because we are being healed, because we are being liberated and set free. We have to be compelled by the joy and the transformation that's happening in our lives and the grace that's been extended to us exactly where we are. So this is your challenge as apostles, as evangelists, as people with missionary zeal and called to those things. This week, I want you to do more than just think about it. I want you to actually write down why the gospel is good news for you. And I want you to share it with someone. Maybe that's someone in your house. Maybe that's a spouse or a parent or a child. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's someone else in this church or in your Sunday school class. But write it down and then tell someone why you are a Christian. How following Jesus the Christ has changed your life for the better. Because that change in ourselves, that transformation towards a greater love of God and of neighbor, that has to be the root of our apostleship. That has to be the root of our evangelism. That has to be the root of all of our zeal. Amen.